Hello my sweet friends and welcome back to another monthly wrap up. Today we're going to be talking about the books that I read in October. Crazy. But as per usual, we'll start off with our stats. So I read 12 books in October, which I'm very happy about. In terms of my TBR, I want to say I completed it, but I also don't know if I can consider it completed because I technically only finished 4 out of the 6 books on my TBR, but I DNF'd the other 2. So in my mind, if I finish the book or if I DNF it, it's still counted as completed because it's off my TBR. I'm done with it. And the books that I DNF'd aren't soft DNFs. They are just complete DNFs. I'm not gonna go back and read them. So I'll briefly touch on which books I DNF'd and why I DNF'd them. The first one was Rush. This book was sent to me as an ARC, which I'm very, very thankful for, but a few of you guys in the comments when I picked it to be part of my TBR said, Rachel, I'm not really sure if this book is for you. So I did a little bit more research. I looked into the book a little bit more, and a lot of people are saying it's basically erotica. Like, it is just straight smut, and that is just completely not my vibe. So I said thank you but goodbye. I don't think this book is going to be for me. Also, the Goodreads reviews are really bad. Like, I have not seen a book with that low of an average rating in a long time. So I was just like, I'm not even gonna waste my time trying. Is it even a DNF if I didn't even start it? I'm not sure, but I'm gonna be unhauling that book because I just don't think it's gonna be for me. And the other book that I decided to DNF was called A British Girl's Guide to Hurricanes and Heartbreak. And honestly, I just started this book and I was like, I am so uninterested in this and I can't see myself being interested in it anytime soon. So I decided to DNF it. I gave it like, I don't know, 50 pages or something, and I was just like, I could not care less about this book. So I'm just gonna move on and count it as a loss, which is fine with me. I'm not saying this is a bad book. I just don't think it's a book for me. It is a YA romance. It's also the second book in an interconnected standalone series, and I did not read the first book. So again, do with that information what you will. I'm sure it's a book that a lot of people enjoy. I don't know why. I literally can't even tell you what my reasoning was apart from I just didn't care about it at all. So those are the books that I DNF'd this month. But moving into the books that I actually read and really enjoyed, let's start off with the first book that I finished this month, which was A Curious Beginning by Deanna Raybourn. I read it on my Kobo because it is a part of Kobo Plus, and Kobo Plus, if you don't know, is like the equivalent of Kindle Unlimited but for Kobo. And I wanted to read this book for so long. It is the first book in a cozy mystery series that also has a subplot of romance, and I got this recommendation from Katie is Reading. She loves this series, and usually books that she loves I also really love. So anything that she rates really highly or talks about a lot, I'll probably eventually read because I really just trust her opinion. And this book was so much fun. It was such a fun premise. We are basically following Veronica Speedwell, who just kind of gets caught up in a series of unfortunate events, I guess, and she ends up kind of stuck with this guy, and unfortunately because of the relationships that they have with certain people, they have become suspects in a murder mystery. So they are now trying to solve that murder mystery to prove that they are innocent. So it's really fun. You kind of just follow them as they run around and do all of these really fun little adventures. They end up at like a carnival at one point, and it's just supposed to be a silly, goofy time. And whilst I did enjoy it a lot, I do think that I just didn't give this book the best chance because I read it over the course of like a month, and anytime I spread out a book too much, I just don't end up enjoying it as much as I think I usually could have. I think if I'd sat down and just like read this book within a week or so, I probably would have rated it higher. I ended up giving it 3.75, so definitely not a bad rating at all, but I think it honestly could have been like a 4-star or above if I hadn't dragged it out so much, because to me the story felt dragged out. But now in reflection, I think that was just because I read it so slowly, and I just don't think I gave this book the best chance. So I would recommend this book. I think if you also like Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies, I would definitely recommend it because obviously it had those same cozy vibes, but also I think Emily Wilde is the main character and Veronica Speedwell as the main character have a lot of similarities. So if you like Emily Wilde, I would recommend it. And I think I might continue the series at some point, but it's not one that I'm like racing back to. I'm not like desperate to read the next book in the series, but I might pick up the next book at some point. I'm not sure. I'm not against it, but I'm not like obsessed with it. So we'll see. The next book that I picked up was You With a View by Jessica Joyce. I gave this book 4 stars. I really liked it. In this book we are following Noelle, and she is grieving the loss of her grandmother who she was really close to. episode, and she is just trying to do anything she can to feel close to her grandmother again. So when she finds out that her grandma had an ex-fiance that she never even knew existed, she basically goes on this little adventure to try and find this ex-fiance, and when she does and starts kind of learning more about him and his life story and his relationship with her grandmother, she then goes on a little road trip for reasons that you find out in the book. Okay, this is going to be a mouthful, but just stay with me on this one. It turns out that her grandma's ex-fiance's grandson was her rival in high school, so she is now kind of reacquainted with this guy from high school, and they end up going on this road trip together along with the ex-fiance, which is the guy's granddad, and they just, yeah, go on this little adventure together. It's very sweet, and I definitely think the granddad in this book was an absolute highlight for me. He was so cute and funny, and I feel like if he wasn't such a big part of this book, I wouldn't have liked it nearly as much. It was one of those books where the more I read it, the more I liked it. I didn't love it at the beginning, but I feel like I kind of slowly got attached to the characters. But yeah, it wasn't one of those books where I was like immediately loving it. I do think the romance was like kind of meh to me. Like, I enjoyed it. It was good, but it wasn't anything crazy to me. It was also a little bit more spicy than I was expecting. So definitely keep that in mind if that's something that you do or don't like. But it was a cute book. I had a good time. Next we have Ready or Not by Cara Bastone, and this was a 5-star read for me. This was so freaking good. I'm so glad that I picked this up. I bought this book when I was in New York because I was obsessed with the cover and it was set in New York. So I was kind of like, well, surely I pick up a book that is set in New York while I'm in New York, and I finally picked it up this month and I was utterly obsessed with this book. Oh, it like makes me excited just like talking about it again, but I just thought this was a perfect rom-com, in my opinion. I just don't think I could have asked for anything more than what this book gave me, and it's very interesting because I don't think this is like a 5-star for everyone. It's not one of those books where everyone is like, oh my gosh, I loved it so much. Like, a lot of people are like, yeah, it was a good time, but I don't know why. It just hit different for me. It was just the best book ever. Like, I just had so much fun. I loved every single character. I loved the character development, not only for our main character, but just for like so many characters in this book. It felt real to me. It felt very raw to me. I thought the romance was done so well. It was such a slow burn, and it was much more of like a friends to lovers story, which was perfect to me. I love friends to lovers and I love slow burn. It also didn't have much spice, maybe like 1 or 2 scenes, but this book follows Eve, and she has a one-night stand with a guy that she does not know, and she gets pregnant, and so now she is trying to figure out what her life is going to look like. She was very, very comfortable. She had a comfortable job, she had a comfortable living situation, she had friendships that she was very comfortable in, and this is kind of like the first thing that has like shaken up her life in a long time, and now she has to figure out what life is going to look like, what her job's going to look like, what her friendships are going to look like, what motherhood is going to look like for her, and I just thought it was done so well. I will say there is a lot of discussion about pregnancy in this book, so if that is not something you are interested in, or if you don't want to read about that, you will not like this book. There are so many scenes discussing like symptoms that she has during pregnancy, like morning sickness and nausea and all of those things, as well as we see so many scenes of her going to her various appointments and discussing all the things that happen in those appointments. Like, it is very mundane in a lot of ways, and again, if you don't want to hear about pregnancy or like those mundane parts of pregnancy, this is not the book for you. I find pregnancy and motherhood and birth and all of those topics very fascinating, so I think that actually just added to my interest in this book, but I can see how that is like a topic that maybe a lot of people don't find interesting and therefore would maybe get bored by in this book, if that makes sense. But yeah, I thought it was just written about so well. I also feel like the main character in this book, like our female main character, was super witty, and she reminded me a lot of like a Lorelai Gilmore. So if that's like your kind of humor, if you like that witty back and forth, that banter, I think you would really like our main character. I just get so happy when I think about this book because it was just such a breath of fresh air to me. Like, it just was one of those books where I picked it up, I wasn't expecting to be obsessed with it, and every single page I just loved, and I just wanted to stay in this book forever. So it was such a clear 5-star for me, but I can see this obviously not being a 5-star for everyone. I just think it was the right book at the right time for me, and I just loved it. I just had so much fun with it. So Ready or Not, adding to my list of 5-star reads for 2025, which is honestly not that long, so it's a very prestigious spot in my opinion, and this book deserves it. The next book that I picked up was All This Twisted Glory by Tahara Murphy. This is the author of the Shatter Me series, and this is the 3rd book in a different series. I don't know if the series is just called This Woven Kingdom, but the first book is called This Woven Kingdom, the second book is called These Infinite Threads, and this is the third book. I do love the cover of this. This is literally gorgeous. This series is kind of about a girl who is like a lost heir. She's like the princess of this specific lineage, but she is living as a servant. So she is a princess, but no one knows that she is the princess. She's kind of like hiding in plain sight, I guess. Like she's just living her normal life as a servant, but no one actually knows that she's a princess, or like the lost princess. And it's very much like a romantasy. Like it's a very big romance plot. I have loved the way that the romance has developed throughout the series and kind of like the things that have changed. It is fun. I think Tahereh Mafi writes love interests very well. But I think my main criticism of this book is that this one just felt like such an in-between book. It was like, yeah, things happened, but like, did anything actually happen? It didn't feel like a book that could stand on its own, and that's just like a personal pet peeve of mine. If a book feels like an in-between book, I'm just kind of like, why? I think each book should be strong in its own right, and this book just didn't feel like that to me, but I still enjoyed it. The next book that I picked up is Delicate Escape by Catherine Cowles. I was so pleasantly surprised by this book. This is part of a small town romance series. I think this is just, yeah, this is the second book, and I think the third book is either out or it's about to come out, which I'm excited about. And I really love this series because it's kind of following almost like a foster family, where each sibling in this foster family gets their own book, and all of the kids in this family live in the same small town, so obviously they show up in each other's books. And I just think that like the found family and like the family dynamics between these siblings is so beautiful. Like they really just show up for each other and they really just love each other so much, and I love that. And I think it's just a really unique family dynamic situation where they're not like technically all family, but they act like it. It's just really sweet. But they all definitely have trauma, like so much trauma. Like I feel like Catherine Cowles, that is kind of what she writes. She writes small town, suspense, trauma. So if you like reading about those things, I definitely recommend her books. I think they're very similar to like a Devney Perry type of book. So if you like Devney Perry, you'd probably like Catherine Cowles. I really enjoy her books, and I think they are perfect palette cleansers especially, but I also just think they're good small town romances in their own right. I've read the entire Tattered and Torn series by Catherine Cowles, which is like 5 books. Yeah. And then I read the first book in this series and now the second book, and I think this is my favorite book by her, purely because I think this one was a bit more emotional before it got physical. She definitely writes like a decent amount of spice in her books, so be aware of that if you're going to read her books. There's definitely spice in them, like a decent amount, I would say. I personally just like skip over it, so it's not really an issue, but just keep that in mind. But this one just didn't feel as spicy as some of the other books that I've read by her, which I personally really enjoyed, just because that is my personal preference. And I feel like we just got a lot more depth and a lot more emotion out of our characters. And I think the main reason why we didn't get as much spice as quickly in this book is because our female main character is very traumatized by a previous relationship, so she is moving very slowly within the romance in this book. And I love a slow burn. I love a slow moving romance. I love it when it takes a long time to get any actual romance, and there's just like a lot of tension before that, and there's a lot of like pining or groveling or just like doing nice things for them without actually like being together yet. Like I love that. So this book was great if that is your thing. And like I said, she writes a lot of like small town suspense romances, so it's mostly a romance, but there'll be like an element of almost like thrillerness in them, which I always really enjoy. I find it just a lot more interesting than a typical romance book. It just adds something a little bit different. And in this book, I thought it was done really well, and I did not expect the person who ended up being the bad guy to be the bad guy. Like I thought they were so good, and then they ended up being the bad guy. I was shocked. I loved it. So 4 stars from me. This was a lot of fun. The next book that I read was A Carne by Lynette Noni, and this was so much fun. I will say, I did not love this at the beginning. It took me a while to actually get invested in this book. It felt to me at the beginning quite clunky and very YA. So if you're going to start this series, I want to warn you, it feels so YA. I'm now onto the second book, and I've started the second book, which I'll probably talk about in my next wrap up, of course, but it still feels very YA. So if you don't like YA, do not read this series. But I personally am a sucker for YA fantasy specifically, and when I started this book, I was just kind of like, oh, this is not going to be a book for me. Like I said, it felt clunky, it felt just a bit cringy, I guess. But for some reason, the more I read it, I somehow just got attached to these characters. I don't know how, and I can't explain to to you what changed my mind, but for some reason my brain just started really liking these characters and really just wanting to know what was going to happen. And now I feel so attached to these characters, and again, I have no idea why, because I don't think this writing is particularly groundbreaking or amazing. Also, the plot, like, what even is it? It's not very strong at all. It's very much just following, I should tell you what it's about. We are following our main character, Alex, and she is from the human world, and she almost like accidentally enters this magical world, and she ends up at a magical school, and it doesn't seem like the humans really know that this magical world exists, and I don't think that the magical world knows that the humans and like the normal world exists either, so she kind of has to pretend that she's not from another world. It's very interesting. But at this magical school, you learn how to use magic and also a bunch of other random skills as well. Like, they still have to do chemistry and biology and things like that, but they also get trained on their gifts. So all of these kids have different gifts. Some kids might have invisibility, or they might just be really good at fighting, or they might be really good at persuasion or something. Like, they're all completely different, and so you get to learn how to use those as well. You also get taught combat and like horse riding. Like, it's very random, honestly, but it's like a boarding school, and so Alex starts living at this school, and she makes friends, and she goes to her classes, and you kind of just follow her doing that. There's also a magical library, which is a big component of the story, and there's also like a bad guy who kind of comes in. I can't really say what he's doing, but he's present in the story. So I think my main criticism of this book is that there is no like direct plot. You are just following Alex along as she has her first year in this magical school. Like, that is kind of the extent of it. As she makes friends, as she goes to classes, as she tries to deal with the bad guy. Like, that is kind of it. So I do think this book could have been better if there was a very prominent plot. It just feels like it should be a book that has a more prominent plot, but it is more character based, I guess. So again, keep that in mind if you're going to start this book. It is not super plot heavy. It's much more character driven, but I do think this was a big like setup book. Like, I do think we are gonna get a lot more like plot in the other books, because I feel like we were trying to just kind of establish the setting, the relationships, and also like the villain in this book. So I'm definitely going to continue the series. I'm really excited to continue the series. It's one of those books that I've started to think about when I'm not reading the book, which is really interesting because I don't feel like it's like that amazing, but for some reason I'm just so attached to this world and to these books. Again, I can't explain to you why. I wish I could, but I just love them. I love Alex, I love the boys. I also love one of the other friendships that develops towards the end of the book, which I don't want to say because I feel like it'll ruin things, but it's just so much fun. So I gave this a 4.25 because I do have some criticisms, and it did take me a second to really get invested, but once I was invested, I was invested. Next, I read Songs in Ursa Major, which was really fun. I gave this one a 3.5. I enjoyed it, but it wasn't like a top favorite of mine. This one is historical fiction, and it reminded me a lot of Daisy Jones and the Six in terms of like the setup and like the main storyline. So we are following our main character Jane. It's set in the 70s, and she is basically just trying to make it in the music industry. So we follow kind of themes of women in the music industry in the 70s and how they are just not seen as legitimate artists, even though men are. We also follow a lot of family dynamics and just like kind of the trauma that Jane has been through with her family, and there's also a romance in this book as well. So we look at a lot of different things, but overall it just gives very much like 70s sex, drugs, rock and roll energy, which is very similar to Daisy Jones and the Six. But I think because it was so reminiscent of Daisy Jones and the Six, it kind of just felt like a knockoff version of Daisy Jones. And it's sad because I went into this book being like, I hope this gives me Daisy Jones and the Six energy, because even just the cover I feel like gives Daisy Jones and the Six energy. Do you know what I mean? Like, it felt like that's what it was trying to do, and so that's the expectations that I went in with, and I feel like again it didn't live up to Daisy Jones. It wasn't as good, and I feel like if you're gonna read a book with these themes and this setting, just read Daisy Jones. But it was still good. Like, I enjoyed my reading experience, and I got to the end and I was very satisfied with the ending and with the storyline. I just don't think it's like a top recommendation, but it was good and the vibes were there, so I appreciate that. Next we have The Anatomy of Songs by Megan White. This is an Australian author, which is really cool, and this is an adult fantasy standalone, which is also really cool because I feel like we don't get a lot of fantasy standalone. I unfortunately didn't love this one. I gave it 3 stars. I thought it was good, but it just wasn't enough for me. It just felt like a lot of tropes and a lot of storylines that I have seen many times before, unfortunately. I think if I had read this book a couple of years ago, I probably would have really loved it, but now that I've just read a lot of fantasy books, and don't get me wrong, I'm not a fantasy expert, but I've just read a lot of books that have, similar themes and similar tropes and things. And so it just felt like it wasn't doing anything new for me. Again, I think this could be a really good book for other people, especially if you haven't read the same tropes 100 times. And sometimes when I read tropes that I've seen a lot of times before, it doesn't bother me because it still either gives me something new or maybe it just does it better. I might really like the character and get attached to them or something like that, but this just didn't do any of that for me. So it was just very meh, and I already have forgotten so much about this book because I just did not care. It's basically about a woman who is a healer by day, assassin by night, and she has a romance with the prince. It was fine, but just a very 3-star book to me. Next I picked up Better Hate Than Never by Chloe Leese, and I think this is my favorite Chloe Leese book that I've read. I gave it 4 stars and I just had a lot of fun with it. We are following Katrina and Christopher. Katrina kind of feels like the outcast in her own family. She never really felt like she belonged, and Christopher was basically adopted almost by her family, so he kind of sees her parents as his parents and her sisters as his sisters, but because she always felt like an outcast, she was just like never really home, so he doesn't have the same sort of like sisterly relationship with her that he has with her sisters. And I think they hold a lot of resentment for each other because of that situation. Like, she resents that he is so much a part of the family that she feels so excluded from, and he resents that she doesn't appreciate the family that he is now a part of and he loves so much, and he's kind of like, well, why wouldn't you want to spend so much more time with them? Like, why are you never home? Why don't you want to participate in this family? So they both hold a lot of resentment towards each other for those reasons, and they've never really spent much time together. But for certain reasons, Kate has moved home, and so now they're kind of spending a lot of time together for the first time ever. They do definitely start off on the wrong foot, but eventually they do really like each other, and they obviously fall in love because it's a romance book. That's what you would expect. But she is also neurodivergent and he suffers from chronic migraines, so it's a really interesting relationship, and it's just a little bit different from a classic rom-com because of those things. I feel like Chloe Leese always focuses on some kind of diversity in her books, and I feel like she does it very well. And this is also part of an interconnected standalone series. So this is book 2. The first one is called Two Wrongs Make a Right, and in each book we are following one of the sisters in this family. There will be a third book coming, I think it's coming next year, and I'm really excited to read that and see the last sister's story, I guess, because there are 3 daughters and obviously 3 books. But yeah, this one was my favorite that I've read so far, and I really enjoy it. I do think you probably should start with the first book in the interconnected standalone series, because this book definitely like references a lot of things from the first book and a lot of characters from the first book, and you just wouldn't get the full picture if you hadn't read the first book. But I do think this one's better, so you like technically don't have to, but it's probably better. You guys can decide what you want to do with that, I guess. The next book that I picked up was Daydream by Hannah Grace. This is the 3rd book in the Maple Hills series, and I think this one is my favorite out of that series so far. I gave this one 4.25 stars. I just really liked Henry and I really liked Hallie. I loved that it was much more of like a slow burn, and it was much more of like a friends to lovers story. That was just really fun to read. I also just loved how much of our other side characters that we met in the first 2 books that we got in this book. I feel like now that we're 3 books into the series, we know a lot of the side characters really well, and just being able to see them in this book was just really nice. I love found family so much, and so if I get a book with a lot of found family, like, of course I'm gonna enjoy it, and this book had a lot of found family. I guess the main plot of this book is that we have Henry, who is on the hockey team, and he isn't doing super well in one of his classes, and he has to be doing decently well in all of his classes to be on the hockey team. So he's kind of stressed about that. And then we meet Hallie, and she's like, oh my gosh, I love that professor. I know how he marks. I know like how to do well in that class, I guess. And so let me help you. There's like a lot more that goes into it than that, but that is like the very basic premise of it. Hallie is helping Henry with this class, and also Henry is helping Hallie because she is trying to write her own romance book, but doesn't really have a lot of romance experience. Like, she hasn't been on a lot of dates. She was dating this guy for like a while, and he was awful. So he never even like really took her on dates and did anything nice for her. Anyway, we don't like him. But Henry steps in and he's like, let me show you romance. Let me give you a date. Let me give you that sort of romance experience that you want for your book. So they're doing this like mutual deal sort of situation. It's really sweet, and it just kind of goes from there. I think my only like criticisms of this one was that sometimes it felt a little bit dragged out, I guess. Like, some things felt felt a little bit repetitive. And although I really liked the characters and I did really like them together, I wasn't like obsessed with the actual like romance. Like I think I just liked the characters as friends almost more than I liked them as a couple, but I also think they suit each other really well. And so I'm happy they ended up together. But when it comes to like friends to lovers, I think sometimes I enjoy the friends part more than the lovers part, and I think that's the case with this book, but I still really enjoyed it overall and I would still recommend it. Then I read The Witch is Back, and this is just such a fun little witchy rom-com. It's kind of like a marriage of convenience situation because we are following our main character who is technically a witch in this world and in this story. Witches just all kind of end up in these arranged marriages. It's not for love, it's literally just like a reputation, family, money sort of situation. Like the parents will decide who you marry, and so she is arranged to marry actually her like best friend who she is pretty much in love with, and so they are engaged, they're supposed to be getting married, and then for some reason the guy runs away, and the girl is really sad about this because obviously they were best friends, but also she was in love with him and she was really excited to marry him. So now she's really embarrassed because she's like, did he just run away because he literally didn't want to marry me? Like that is so embarrassing. So she kind of gets out of that whole witchy world and she is now working at a bar in the normal human world. And now it's like, I can't remember exactly, I want to say like 7 years later, and she is just at the bar working, and guess who walks in? Her ex-fiance who broke her heart like 7 years ago. And he walks in and he's like, we need to get married, and she's like, what? No. But then it kind of gets explained, there's more to it than that, and she's kind of like, oh, we do have to get married. So now we're just following them as they kind of have to get married but don't really want to get married, but then eventually they get feelings for each other, and it's just really fun. It had a bit more depth to it than I was expecting it to have, and I also thought the plot was genuinely interesting and genuinely like well done. Like the conflict made sense, the resolution made sense, and I just found like the magic and the world building, it was very like minor, like it was very much like urban fantasy type vibes, but I thought it was just done really well. So I gave this one 4.25 and I really recommend it. And the last book that I read in the month of October was The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches. I feel like I am so late to the bandwagon of this one. I feel like everyone read this like 2 years ago and I never did, and now I finally have, and I get the hype. This was so much fun. After I read The Witch is Back, I was like, wait, witchy rom-coms are so fun. I want to read another one. And this one I had just got in the mail, so I was like, perfect timing, I'm gonna pick this up. And this was everything. It was so freaking good. 5 stars. This was so cozy, so wholesome, so sweet, so fun, found family, romance, funny. Oh, it was just everything I could have wanted it to be and more. Again, I was not expecting to love this as much as I did. I just heard that it was really cozy and I was like, sign me up. I love cozy books. In this book we are following, I don't actually know how to say the main character's name. Is it Mika or Micah? I want to say Micah, but I don't know. And she is a witch. I'll really like make this short and sweet because it's a bit more than this, but she basically gets hired to be a tutor at this school, or it's really like a house, I guess. She gets hired to be a tutor at this house where 3 little orphan witches live. So there's this witch that owns this house and she kind of takes in these orphan witches, but although she like owns this house and whatnot, she's just like never there. But she has a lot of staff that work at this house and like people that live at this house that kind of make everything run, like a housekeeper and a gardener, and there's a librarian. Like there's a lot of people at this house. So they have been raising these 3 children, but they have realized that these children have started to get their like witch power, but they don't know how to use it, and these other staff can't teach them because these staff are not witches. So they hire our main character to come and be a tutor and teach them how to use their magic, how to contain their magic, and just like how to be witches. So she comes and lives at this house, becomes this tutor, and it is just like so cozy, and there is just so much found family. She becomes so attached to the kids and so attached to all of the other people that live and work in this house, and there's also a romance. Oh, it's just so good. It's so good. 5 stars. I don't think there was anything else I could have wanted out of this book. It did give me kind of similar vibes of House on the Cerulean Sea. Still very much like a different storyline and different situation, but that whole like a house for like magical like outcasts, I guess you could say, and then like someone comes to that house and they just like fall in love with the kids and with the people there. So if you liked House on the Cerulean Sea, I definitely recommend this, or vice versa if you've read this but haven't read House on the Cerulean Sea. Very like cutesy similar vibes. This was just so sweet and I loved every minute of it. I was not expecting this to be a 5-star, but it was, which means we had 2 new 5-star reads this month, which is incredible. I feel like I haven't had that for a while, so I was very happy with that. I feel like I just had such a fun reading month, and I guess that means we only have 2 months left of reading for the year. And there are so many books that I still want to get to, so I guess we'll see what I read in November next month when I sit down for my wrap up. But for now, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Please let me know what your favorite read of October was. I would love to know, and I guess I'll see you guys in my next video very soon. Goodbye.